The city had a rhythm of its own, a heartbeat of neon lights, distant sirens, and the faint hum of traffic that never truly stopped. Marco Romano moved through the streets like a shadow, his tailored suit brushing against the wet pavement of the narrow alley behind the club he ran. The alley smelled of damp concrete and gasoline, the faint coppery tang of old blood lingering from past violence, unspoken yet ever present. Marco's thoughts were heavy, looping again and again around the phrase he had once muttered to himself, almost as a warning: "I believed hell was red, but it's gray, and you kneel broken before me." The words echoed in his mind, strange and unsettling, because he had always thought of hell as fire, screams, punishment, something loud, something visible. Yet tonight, the city felt muted, drained of color. Gray stretched out over every surface, a quiet suffocation that mirrored the betrayal gnawing at him. Tony's betrayal wasn't something new. Marco had seen it coming, the reckless mistakes, the whispered lies, the careless gamble that had almost cost the family a shipment that could have sparked war. But seeing it in full, knowing the gravity of what could have happened, weighed differently on him. Marco had built his life on rules, discipline, and an unspoken code. People like Tony were not supposed to falter, they were supposed to earn respect, to carry the weight of the family's trust as if it were their own life. But Tony had failed spectacularly. And tonight, he would learn that failure had a price. Marco's steps echoed softly against the brick walls of the alley, each footfall deliberate, controlled. He was calm, but inside, a storm churned. The calm wasn't weakness, it was certainty. Tony froze before he even saw Marco fully. The dim light from a flickering lamp overhead cast long shadows across the narrow space, making Tony's wide eyes and pale, sweaty face look almost spectral. Marco watched silently as the man realized, too late, that he was trapped. There was no door to escape, no friendly face to intervene. The world had shrunk down to this gray corridor, to the weight of Marco's gaze, to the quiet authority that radiated from him like heat from an invisible fire. Tony's breathing grew rapid, his chest rising and falling under his thin shirt. He had always thought he was clever, that small risks wouldn't catch up to him. But he underestimated Marco, and the alley itself seemed to confirm it. Every shadow was judgment, every crack in the wall whispered consequences. Marco stopped a few steps behind him, letting the silence stretch. He didn't need to speak yet, silence was louder than any threat. Finally, Tony's knees gave way, and he dropped to the wet ground with a soft thud. Not because Marco demanded it, Tony's fear had forced him down. The suddenness of it made him flinch, his hands gripping the damp concrete as if it could somehow save him. Marco leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. His mind was not in the moment, it was elsewhere, running through memories of every time he had trusted someone, every time loyalty had been repaid with treachery. Tony had once been a friend, a loyal foot soldier who had fought beside Marco in the streets, in back rooms where deals were made and lives were sometimes lost in the blink of an eye. And now, that loyalty had been sold cheaply, bartered away for greed or fear or foolish pride. Marco's lips pressed into a thin line. The alley was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed on your ears and made your skin crawl. "I believed hell was red, Tony," Marco said finally, his voice low, smooth, yet carrying an unshakable weight. "But it's gray. Gray like this alley, gray like the choices you made." He began to circle Tony slowly, each step measured, deliberate, a predator savoring the realization of its prey. The light flickered overhead, catching on Marco's sharp features, making his eyes glint like cold steel. "And you kneel broken before me." Tony's face was pale, sweat and grime mingling on his forehead. His eyes darted, looking for some escape, some mercy, but finding none. Marco's words sank into him like stones into water, and the ripples of fear spread through every limb. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, a stammered attempt at excuses that fell flat. Marco raised a hand to silence him. There was no room for words, no hope of bargaining. Actions had consequences, and tonight, those consequences had a name. The alley seemed to shrink further, pressing down on both men, holding its breath for the judgment to come. Marco's mind ran through options: violence, intimidation, the kind of swift, brutal punishment that cemented fear into the bones of those who betrayed him. But tonight, he decided, would not be about the spectacle. It would be about the lesson. Tony needed more than a scar, he needed the understanding of what it meant to betray, what it meant to kneel broken before someone who once trusted you. Every detail of the moment burned into Marco's mind: the cold damp under his shoes, the faint scent of oil and garbage, the tremble of Tony's hands, the way the man's shoulders slumped as if the weight of his life had condensed into this single moment. The grayness of the alley wasn't just in color, it was in atmosphere, in the emotion, in the realization that life could be quieter, duller, and yet infinitely more terrifying than any blazing fire. Marco stopped in front of Tony, looking down at the man who had once called him a friend. The city hummed faintly around them, indifferent to the tiny theater of betrayal unfolding in the alley. He knew the lesson tonight would follow Tony for the rest of his life, a dull, persistent gray that would remind him of every misstep, every foolish choice. The encounter was complete, the stage set, and the weight of Marco's presence was a sentence no plea could overturn. Tony was broken, and in this gray moment, he would understand the full depth of what he had lost. The alley remained quiet, almost conspiratorial, as Marco's shadow stretched over Tony like a weight he could not lift. Every sound of the city seemed muted here, as if the world itself understood that this was not an ordinary confrontation. The rain had stopped moments ago, leaving the air thick and heavy, smelling of wet concrete and stale tobacco from discarded cigarette butts. Tony's knees were pressed into the damp ground, cold seeping through the thin fabric of his trousers, but it was nothing compared to the icy grip of fear that tightened around his chest. He had imagined many ways his reckoning could come: a blunt fist, a warning shot, perhaps even the subtle humiliation of a whispered threat. But the reality of Marco Romano's presence was something else entirely. It was heavier, more suffocating, like a storm pressing down on every fiber of his being. Marco circled Tony slowly, his polished shoes making a soft rhythm against the concrete, each step deliberate, precise, and unrelenting. The low hum of a distant car engine seemed to punctuate the weight of every word that hovered unsaid between them. "I believed hell was red, Tony," Marco said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the authority of a man who had seen the darkest sides of human nature, a man who had judged and condemned silently more times than he could count. "But it's gray. Gray like this alley, gray like the life you've chosen to risk, gray like the future you're staring at now. And you kneel broken before me." His eyes, dark and penetrating, didn't waver, and Tony felt them burn into his soul, as if Marco could see not just his betrayal, but every choice, every thought, every moment that had led him to this instant. Tony's lips trembled as he tried to speak, the words coming out as little more than stammers and broken pleas. I didn't mean," he began. But Marco's raised hand cut him off before the sound could even finish. Words, he realized, would not undo the damage. They could not undo the loss of trust, the risk of war, the shame of betrayal. Marco's silence pressed down harder than any shout could, and Tony felt the full weight of accountability settle on his shoulders like an iron chain. The betrayal was no longer theoretical, no longer a series of mistakes, it was tangible, real, and the consequences were here, immediate and undeniable. Marco leaned closer, the sharp scent of his cologne mingling with the damp alley, a subtle reminder of the man's power and control. His voice dropped even lower, smooth but lethal in its precision, carrying the weight of command that left no room for negotiation. "Tony, I gave you everything. Protection, opportunity, a family. And for what? A fleeting moment of greed? A careless gamble that could have cost lives, could have destroyed everything I've built. You risked it all for a mistake that could have been avoided. You risked your place in this world, in my world, for something small and meaningless. And now, here you are, kneeling, realizing that life does not forgive, not when you betray the people who trusted you." Tony's hands shook, and his knees pressed further into the damp concrete, his face pale and drawn. He had lived his life on the edge of fear and loyalty, thinking that cleverness could shield him, that mistakes could be undone. But Marco's presence shattered those illusions. He realized in a piercing moment of clarity that his life had always been fragile, built on the wrong foundations, and tonight, the truth was exposed. Hell was not flames or screaming, it was quiet, it was constant, and it was gray. It was the oppressive realization that every choice carried weight, and every misstep would be remembered. Marco continued to circle, slow and deliberate, each movement a lesson in control, each glance a reminder of what had been lost. "You think hell is fire and chaos," Marco said, his voice now a low, steady rumble, almost intimate in its gravity, "but hell is this, Tony. Hell is living with the knowledge that you have failed the people who trusted you most. Hell is waking up every day knowing that you are weaker than you imagined, that your choices are visible to those who can, and will, use them against you. Gray is the silence after the scream, the weight after the punishment. Gray is the reality of life stripped of illusions, where fear and regret are your constant companions." The word struck Tony with the force of inevitability. He bowed his head further, sweat and rainwater mingling on his skin, realizing that there was no bargaining here, no chance for clever reasoning. The grayness of the alley was mirrored in his own mind, and for the first time, he understood fully the emptiness that comes when trust is broken, when the safety of belonging is shattered. Every breath he drew seemed heavier, every heartbeat a reminder of the precariousness of his existence. He was kneeling, yes, but it was not just a physical act. It was a surrender of his illusions, his arrogance, and his false sense of security. Marco's gaze softened slightly, though it was not pity. It was recognition of the gravity of the lesson, of the understanding that Tony had to reach this realization for himself. "Get up, Tony," he said finally, his voice still low but edged with authority. "You will work. Every day, you will earn back the trust you have broken. Fail, and you will see just how gray hell can be. This is your chance, and it will not come again. Remember, hell is not what you expect. Hell is this, the quiet, the gray, the weight of knowing what you have lost and the effort it takes to regain it. Do not fail again, because there will be no mercy." Tony slowly lifted himself from the wet concrete, his hands trembling as he steadied himself against the wall. He was alive, but in a way that felt heavier than death. Fear, shame, and a strange, reluctant respect coursed through him as he realized that he had been given a path forward, a chance for redemption, yes, but one that would be measured, deliberate, and unforgiving. Every step he took away from that alley would be a reminder of his failure, and every choice thereafter would carry the weight of the lesson Marco had delivered. The gray of the alley lingered in his mind, an indelible mark of the reckoning he had faced. Marco watched him leave, the echoes of his footsteps fading into the city night. The lesson had been delivered, and the silence of the gray alley spoke louder than any scream could have. Marco knew that Tony would never forget, that the quiet, persistent gray of accountability would haunt him long after the bruises had faded, long after the fear had dulled. And in that quiet, gray space, Marco understood something himself, that true power was not just the ability to instill fear, but the ability to shape understanding, to turn betrayal into a lesson, and to hold the weight of consequences in one's own hands. Quiet, heavy, and absolute, the night had grown colder, and the grayness of the alley seemed to thicken, pressing down on both men like an invisible weight. Marco Romano stood still for a moment, the faint glow of a flickering street lamp catching on the edges of his sharp features, casting his long shadow across the wet pavement. He had watched Tony kneel, trembling, sweat streaking down his pale face, and he had heard the ragged breaths, the stammered attempts at words that came too late to matter. Yet, despite the apparent silence, Marco's mind was far from empty. He had faced betrayal countless times, seen men and women crumble under the weight of mistakes, and had delivered punishment in various forms, each calculated, precise, and inescapable. But this time, the betrayal was different, more personal, sharper, and more cutting than any knife or bullet could convey. Tony had been more than a soldier, he had been a confidant, someone who had walked the streets beside Marco, someone who had earned the trust of a man who rarely trusted anyone fully. The realization of that betrayal lingered in Marco's chest like a dull, persistent ache, a gray wound that no amount of revenge could heal. Marco circled the alley slowly, his movements deliberate, each step echoing softly off the damp walls. He observed Tony like a sculptor studying a flawed statue, noticing every tremble, every faltering breath, every flicker of desperation in the man's eyes. "You think hell is fire and pain, Tony," he began, his voice low, measured, almost intimate, "but hell is not loud. It is quiet. It is gray. It is the life you lead after the choices you've made, after the people you've failed. It is the knowledge that you are alone, that the safety you once took for granted is gone, and that every step forward is shadowed by the weight of your mistakes." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as if the alley itself had become a living entity, listening and responding to the gravity of the judgment being delivered. Tony's head remained bowed, shame coursing through him like a relentless tide. He had imagined punishment many times, a fist, a bullet, humiliation, but none of those had prepared him for this. Marco's judgment was deeper, quieter, more pervasive. It wasn't just about fear, it was about recognition, about the understanding that the life he had known, the life he had believed he controlled, was now irreversibly tainted. Each word Marco spoke was a reminder that respect, trust, and loyalty were fragile commodities, and once broken, no clever words or desperate excuses could restore them. Tony realized with a crushing weight that he had glimpsed the edges of hell not in fire, not in screams, but in the suffocating grayness of his own failure, reflected in the eyes of the man who once called him brother. Marco stopped in front of him, the distance between them charged with silent authority. He looked down at Tony with a gaze that was not cruel, yet carried an unmistakable finality. "You think you understand consequences," Marco continued, his tone steady, deliberate, "but consequences are not immediate, they are enduring. They are quiet, insidious. They settle in your bones, gnaw at your conscience, and make every day a reminder of what you lost. You are not just kneeling before me now, you are kneeling before the life you squandered, the trust you shattered, the future you jeopardized. That is the grayness of hell, Tony, a slow-burning, persistent pain that never leaves you, that reminds you of your own weakness every single day." Tony's hands shook violently as he pressed them against the wet pavement. The rain from earlier had soaked his clothes, leaving him cold and heavy, yet it was nothing compared to the chill that Marco's words had sent coursing through him. Each syllable was a hammer striking not at flesh, but at the very core of his being. He had underestimated the quiet terror of accountability, the subtle power of judgment that did not need spectacle. Marco's presence alone was sufficient to render him small, insignificant, and utterly powerless. He felt the grayness seep into his veins, into his thoughts, into every corner of his mind. This was hell, he realized, a quiet, persistent torment that would follow him forever, more terrifying than any fire or scream he had once imagined. Marco's gaze softened just slightly, but it was not mercy. It was acknowledgement of the weight Tony must now carry, the lesson he needed to internalize. "You will live with this," Marco said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "You will feel it in your sleep, in your waking hours, in every choice you make. You will know that respect is earned, that loyalty is sacred, and that betrayal is not easily forgiven. Some may survive my wrath, but few survive the judgment of their own conscience. And Tony, now, you will join that small group, living each day under the shadow of what you have done. This is your judgment, and there is no escape." Tony's shoulders shook as he bowed even lower, sweat and rainwater mixing on his face, running down into the collar of his shirt. He could not look up, could not meet Marco's eyes, because the shame was too heavy, the grayness too complete. He understood now the full scope of his failure, the depth of the loss, the enduring, quiet punishment that awaited him. This was not just fear, it was understanding, recognition, and a desperate, humbling clarity. He had seen hell, and it was not red, it was not fire, it was gray. Marco remained silent for a moment, letting the lesson settle, letting the weight of his words sink into Tony's mind like slow, unrelenting rain. Then, without another word, he stepped back slightly, the circle complete, the judgment delivered. Tony did not rise immediately, he stayed on his knees, absorbing the gravity of what had been spoken, feeling the grayness of the moment settle in his bones. Marco turned toward the alley's exit, knowing that the path forward was for Tony to walk alone, carrying the lesson, the shame, and the understanding that life was no longer simple, no longer black and white, no longer forgiving. In this gray world, every choice mattered, and every mistake was a shadow that would follow him forever. As Marco's figure receded into the dimly lit streets beyond the alley, Tony remained kneeling, a broken man transformed not by fire or force, but by the quiet, persistent, and unyielding judgment of the one he had betrayed. The grayness lingered, heavy and pervasive, marking the beginning of a new understanding, that betrayal had a cost, and hell was quieter, slower, and infinitely more enduring than he had ever imagined. The alley, damp and dim, seemed to hold its breath, a witness to the unfolding of consequences, the teaching of a lesson that would echo in Tony's mind for the rest of his life, a constant reminder that respect lost was never easily regained. The alley seemed to hold its breath as the weight of judgment settled over Tony like an oppressive fog. Marco Romano stood a few steps back, watching the man he had once trusted, once considered almost a brother, struggle with the enormity of his failure. There was no thunder, no shouting, no sudden violence, only the quiet, relentless understanding that came from facing the consequences of one's own actions. Marco's decision had been deliberate. He could have chosen to enforce the laws of the streets in the way everyone expected, a brutal punishment, a visible mark that would spread fear and gossip through the city, a permanent reminder of betrayal. But tonight was not about spectacle. Tonight was about teaching a lesson that would embed itself into Tony's soul, a lesson that would linger long after bruises healed and fear subsided. The reckoning was quiet, gray, and unyielding, and Marco knew it would shape the man far more than any physical punishment could. Tony's knees pressed into the damp concrete, trembling violently as he struggled to rise. The alley around him seemed to close in, the gray walls reflecting not just the dim light from above but also the bleak truth of his position. Each breath felt labored, every heartbeat heavy, as if his body had absorbed the moral weight of the choices he had made. Marco took a slow step forward, letting the silence stretch, letting the lesson embed itself fully before speaking again. "Tony," he said, his voice calm but deadly precise, "this is not the kind of hell you imagine. You think it is fire and chaos, destruction and pain, but it is far subtler than that. It is gray. It is quiet. It is the life you now face, a life in which every step, every word, every decision carries the memory of your failure, a constant reminder of the trust you shattered and the opportunities you squandered." The word struck Tony like icy water. He forced himself to look up, his eyes meeting Marco's with a mixture of fear, shame, and something else, the faintest glimmer of understanding. He had expected anger, expected punishment, expected the raw, visible consequences of betrayal. Instead, he faced a reckoning that was deeper, subtler, and far more enduring. The grayness Marco spoke of was not simply the physical color of the alley, nor the dim lighting that surrounded them, it was the weight of responsibility, the gravity of living in a world where choices were never free, and consequences were never delayed. Tony realized that life under Marco's gaze was not about punishment alone, it was about accountability, about internalizing the cost of every misstep, every lapse of judgment, every act of disloyalty. Marco stepped closer, the faint scent of expensive cologne mixing with the damp, metallic tang of the alley. His gaze was unyielding, penetrating, and yet it carried more than mere authority. It carried the understanding of a man who had navigated a world of betrayal and violence for decades, a man who had built his empire on precision, strategy, and respect, and who knew that fear alone did not ensure loyalty, only comprehension of one's own failures could. "Get up, Tony," he said, his tone softer but edged with the absolute certainty of command. "You will rise, and you will work. You will earn back what you lost. Every day, you will confront your failure, and you will remember this moment. Fail again, and the gray you feel now will turn into something far darker, far more permanent. Life under this reckoning is unforgiving, and it will not wait for excuses or weakness. You must earn every ounce of respect back, or live with the knowledge that you have forever surrendered it." Tony's legs shook as he slowly pushed himself to his feet, each movement deliberate, cautious, almost ritualistic. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and he felt as though every misstep of his life had converged into this one act of standing, trembling, beneath the cold, calculating gaze of Marco Romano. For the first time, he truly understood the nature of consequences, of the grayness Marco had spoken about, that hell was not a spectacle, but a persistent, invisible force that clung to every choice and every thought, that reminded him constantly of what had been lost, and what would be difficult, if not impossible, to regain. Marco watched silently, his eyes following every faltering movement. The alley was quiet except for the faint drip of water from a rusted pipe above and the distant hum of the city beyond. Marco knew that fear alone was insufficient to instill lasting change. It was the understanding, the internalization of one's failures, that created true transformation. Tony's trembling hands, his bowed head, his slow, deliberate movements, all were evidence that the lesson had taken root. The grayness, that dull and persistent awareness of consequences, was now part of him. He would carry it forward in every step he took, every decision he made, a constant reminder that betrayal came at a cost far greater than he had imagined. Finally, Marco straightened, the last remnants of tension in his posture easing slightly. He did not speak further, there was no need. The lesson had been delivered, the reckoning enacted. Tony would leave the alley a changed man, not merely fearful of reprisal, but keenly aware of the responsibilities and expectations he had violated. Each step he took away from the alley would carry the memory of this night, the weight of the grayness that Marco had described, a quiet torment far more powerful than any visible punishment. The streets would continue, indifferent to the personal theater that had just unfolded, but the echoes of this reckoning would follow Tony for the rest of his life. Marco lingered a moment longer, watching Tony retreat into the dimly lit streets, and allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The grayness of the city, of the night, of life itself, was not simply a color, it was a state of being. It was the weight of choices, the subtle persistence of consequences, the quiet understanding that every act of betrayal carved deep, invisible scars that shaped the lives of both the betrayed and the betrayer. Marco Romano had delivered justice without violence, punishment without bloodshed, and in doing so, had ensured that Tony would understand, in a way that would never fade, the true meaning of loyalty, trust, and the silent, gray hell that awaited those who failed to honor them. Marco Romano stepped out of the alley and into the neon-lit streets of the city, the hum of life all around him contrasting sharply with the oppressive gray he had just left behind. The club he ran loomed ahead, its glass doors reflecting the colorful chaos of the nightlife, yet Marco barely noticed the flickering lights, the laughter spilling into the streets, or the distant honks of impatient drivers. His mind lingered on Tony, on the kneeling figure he had left behind, and on the grayness that had settled over both the man and the alley like a persistent shadow. He had seen many betrayals, many acts of recklessness, many moments where fear and loyalty collided in ways that left permanent scars. Yet tonight felt different. The lesson he had delivered was quiet, subtle, more profound than any fire of revenge could have been. There was power in that quiet, in the gray, in the knowledge that consequences were not always immediate but endured in the marrow, shaping thought, behavior, and conscience alike. As he entered the club, the familiar sights and sounds of his world wrapped around him, the clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversation, the rhythmic beat of music that seemed to echo off the polished floors. The people here depended on him, feared him, respected him, and for the most part, knew him only as the figure of authority, the man who could command loyalty or exact punishment with a glance. Yet Marco's reflection in the polished surface of the bar told him more than any whispered rumor or fearful glance could. Power was not only in what you could take, but in what you allowed, what you taught, and what you enforced without fanfare. True influence was measured not by the screams of those under your command, but by the understanding that they carried with them long after you were gone from their sight. That understanding was gray, heavy, persistent, and infinitely more enduring than any spectacle of violence. He walked toward his office, past familiar faces who nodded with respect, who knew enough to keep their heads down, but not enough to see the calculations behind every decision. Marco Romano had built his empire on observation, on careful planning, on understanding the human psyche in ways that others never fully grasped. And tonight, he had reinforced a lesson that would ripple far beyond a single alley or a single act of betrayal. Tony would carry this moment with him forever. Every misstep, every lapse of judgment, every temptation to betray trust again would be measured against this gray reality, a slow-burning hell of conscience, a reminder that life's consequences were often quiet, unrelenting, and inescapable. Marco settled into his chair behind the massive desk in his office, the city sprawled out before him through rain-streaked windows. The neon glow of the streets below cast fractured patterns of light across the room, reflecting off the polished wood and the gold-trimmed surfaces of the office. The sentence he had whispered, repeated, and internalized throughout the night returned to him once more: I believed hell was red, but it's gray, and you kneel broken before me. It lingered in his mind, heavy and resonant. Not as a threat, but as a truth he had seen in the alley, in Tony's faltering steps, in the realization of human weakness and accountability. Life was not simple, it was not red or black and white. It was gray, filled with choices, mistakes, redemption, and consequences that refused to be ignored. And in that gray, people revealed who they truly were. Some rose to the occasion, others crumbled, but all were shaped irrevocably by the weight of their actions. The city below was alive with motion, yet Marco saw it differently. He saw the threads of connection, the subtle balances of power, the quiet manipulations and fleeting loyalties that most people never noticed. Fear, respect, and loyalty were currencies in a world that seemed chaotic on the surface, but underneath it all ran the slow, steady current of human nature, desires, fears, weaknesses, and strength, all measured in the gray. Marco understood that controlling this flow required more than brute force, it required understanding, patience, and a willingness to bear the weight of judgment without losing one's own humanity. Tony's lesson tonight was a testament to that philosophy. The quiet reckoning, the persistent gray, would shape behavior far more effectively than any blow or bullet ever could. Leaning back in his chair, Marco allowed himself a moment of reflection, one that was rare and fleeting. He thought of the men and women who had knelt before him, of the allies and enemies alike, and of the fragile balance between fear and respect, loyalty and betrayal. The grayness of the world was not a weakness, it was the very fabric of power. To navigate it successfully, one had to embrace both the silence and the weight of consequences, to understand that punishment was not always immediate, and that the lessons that endured were the ones carried quietly, like shadows over every choice and every thought. Marco Romano's empire was built on these truths, and tonight he had reinforced one more: that hell was not red, not loud, not explosive. It was gray, persistent, relentless. And those who understood it would either thrive or be broken entirely. The neon reflections on the glass flickered as rain began again outside, soft at first, then heavier, tapping against the windowpane with a rhythmic insistence. Marco watched the city breathe, the gray streets stretching endlessly into the night, and felt a quiet satisfaction. True power was not in bloodshed alone, nor in fear alone, but in shaping understanding, in holding the gray in one's hands, and in teaching men like Tony that betrayal carried a weight heavier than any fire could inflict. He leaned back further, feeling the calm authority of a man who had faced countless storms and emerged not only unbroken, but fully aware of the subtle dominion he held over both loyalty and conscience. In this gray world, Marco Romano was king, not of chaos, not of fire, but of the quiet, persistent, inescapable weight of life, choices, and consequence. And as he stared out at the city, a king in gray, he understood that this was the truest measure of power, the ability to see the world as it truly was, to command it without spectacle, and to shape it with the steady hand of judgment tempered by understanding.